Hey everybody, Brendan here, welcome back to another tournament game analysis video. Today we'll be covering my first round of the March Excelsior Open. I was 1993 Canadian rating, 1664 FIDE, which is 431st in Canada at the time, and 70,000 or closer to 71,000 internationally. So I was ending up playing Roman Gavrilin, who was from Russia. At least that was their federation. And they had a 2356 Canadian rating, meaning that they were a national master, and they had 2152 FIDE rating, which is actually close to about 11,000 in the world for active players. So quite a bit stronger than me. So let's go into the game now. I was playing with the white pieces, and I played e4. We see the Sicilian, and we end up getting the Najdorf here. Knight to f6, knight c3, and a6. So, of course, I ended up playing my favorite variation, which is rook to g1. So he spent a few minutes here, not too long or anything. He played e5 just after, again, about 2 minutes. There is also b5, which gets into absolutely crazy lines that I had prepared a little bit beforehand. Here's a sample line of a pretty common main line, which is a4, b4, knight d5, sacrificing the e-pawn. And the whole point is you're just going for a ton of development while black does get that extra pawn. So queen e2 here, knight c5, c3, which is pretty cool. The whole point is if you take it, then b4, and you'll eventually grab the c pawn back after g4 with the idea of rook to g3 taking on c3 here. So pretty crazy, but of course he ended up playing the move e5. So I ended up playing the move knight to b3, and now bishop to e6 was played, but there's also h5. And again, rook to g1 does have the idea of playing g4. So with e5 and bishop to e6, he's trying to play in the center. Again, if your opponent's playing on the flank, you should play in the center because there's a good chance that they might not be equipped to deal with it. But h5 is still a reasonable way to play. So h5, h3, bishop to e6, queen to f3 is actually quite interesting, where after h4, bishop d2, knight bd7, and long castles, it shares a lot of similarities with other Najdorf positions because h5 is actually a decently common move in them. So this is absolutely playable. But of course, again, bishop to e6 was played. And I play the move g4. So you need to play d5 here. Any other move is just not a good choice. For example, if you play bishop to e7, yeah, you're actually just clearly worse after g5 and bishop to e3, as white does have a leg up on the attack in their position, because this is a common idea in Najdorf, is to play g4, g5, h4, h5, and go for a kingside attack. So we are already a couple tempos up, which means that black is in trouble there. But instead, d5 starts to liquidate things, and e takes d5, and knight takes d5. So after knight takes d5, I ended up taking on d5. My opponent suggested the move bishop to g2 at the time, but this isn't really in spirit with the position. The problem here is black has a very simple way to gain a decent advantage. After knight takes c3, we trade queens, and then recapture. And after king to c7, their king is never going to be attacked on this square. And there's also these doubled pawns, which in the future could cause quite a bit of problems for us. So I didn't end up playing it like that. Instead, I took on d5, which is the main move. Queen takes d5, we trade queens, and then I go bishop to e3. He ends up playing knight to c6. The idea here is two castle long, and this is the main tabia in the position. So it's been played by a lot of strong players from both sides. From the white side specifically, Jan Christoph Duda, Fedoseev, and Van Foreest have played as white here. So now I ended up playing the move c3, and the reason why is because I'm trying to restrict the knight. It turns out that this actually is not played as much at the higher level, and castles is overwhelmingly played. But I don't really like this move as much. Partially it was biased because there was a book I was reading at the time which suggested that castles is a bit outdated. And the reason why is because there's a certain formation we'd like to play, and it has to do with punishing this queenside here, especially this structure right there. So, yeah, c3 was played. Again, just preventing any knight b4 or knight d4. This really has to be played if you don't end up castling castles, and we're actually not going to be castling in this position. It turns out knight to d2 is quite strong, and the whole idea is that we're eventually going to be prepared to bring something to c4, and again, this bishop is incredibly well placed, targeting this b6, the dark square, and you can imagine, for example, if you play something like bishop to c4, and then bring your knight eventually to b6, or even just playing bishop to b6, it could be quite good. So, yeah, knight to d2, um, bishop to e7 was played, and now a4. So again, it's just one of those restricting moves. It just makes sure that b5 is never possible, because you never know if they actually might want to play that. It's quite unlikely though. But the other reason why it could be good is we might actually get a chance to play a5 and eventually get something kind of stuck on b6 where it's hard to actually get rid of. But there's also another reason behind this move that we will see quite shortly, actually. H6 was played, and this was a pretty good move, actually. So I was quite worried about this because bishop g5 is the idea, right? If black could play, for example, if we just make a silly move here, rook to c1, if they end up playing this move bishop to g5, we don't really want to trade because now this h-pawn is just kind of always a permanent target. And if we let them take, we'll probably have to let them take. It does trade off more pieces where black's bishop was just a little bit more passive than ours of the same color. So yeah, not really something that they really want to do. I ended up playing bishop to c4, and I really liked this when I started analyzing it during the game, but I've come to decide that it's maybe a slightly dubious move compared to something just a little bit stronger. And the idea is b4. So if we play the move b4 here, black is really forced to play e4. And it's because we're going to be playing b5, and they want to have this square available. So takes, and then knight to e5, bishop to e2. If they don't end up playing e4, their position gets pretty bad pretty quick. So for example, bishop to g5, going for their other idea of trying to trade off the bishops. Now b5 comes, and because there's no knight to e5, it's really hard to suggest good moves here. First off, if you move the knight at all first, knight e7 or knight to a5, white will be winning this pawn on a6, just outright, for example, something like this. So they can't really do that. But also, if they trade, this is incredibly ugly. For example, knight to b8, c4, bishop to e6. And it turns out the engine suggests this move rook to g3, which makes complete sense. The whole idea is we're actually ready to trade, and then we're going to bring this rook over, potentially to c3. Maybe not exactly, maybe to e3, just to target e5. But it's in line with ideas of c5 and potentially even c6, just trying to rip open the king. And black's king is actually not safe here, even though it feels like it should be. So pretty interesting idea. Instead, yeah, I ended up playing the move bishop to c4, which I was hesitant to play. I spent a couple minutes on it, but the more I looked at it, the more I liked it. And it's definitely not a bad move by any means. White should have a very, very slight advantage here. So bishop to g5 was played, again trying to take the bishop on e3. But there was also potentially bishop takes on c4, where unfortunately knight takes c4 does kind of immediately show that it's not really a good option, and that bishop g5 just makes a lot more sense. Because, again, getting to target these dark squares for not really a really good reason isn't really something you want to allow. So bishop to g5, king to e2, and they played rook h to e8 here. But there was also bishop takes on e3, which I thought was a little interesting. It turns out you have to be very, very careful how you recapture as white. First off, you can't take on d5. This is a theme we're going to be seeing a little bit later under different circumstances. But the problem here is after bishop takes on d2 exclam, if we take on c6, they can just recapture because we're not, unfortunately, attacking this bishop on d2. So black will be up a piece. And we also don't want to take with the king, because if we take with the king, they can play this move knight e7, and white has to be incredibly careful here. For example, rook a to d1, totally fine move, rook to d7, and we're pretty much being forced to take on d5, even though we don't really want to. And the only way, really, to stay in the game is to take and then play king to d3. That's right, not to e2. The problem is if you ever go somewhere, for example, to e2, you're just losing after knight to f4 because moves like knight to d3 can come and a b2 is being attacked um, and the knight could be loose as well. So that's a very bad position for white. So f takes e3, kind of you're forced to find this by trial and error, but it's a really good move. After f takes e3, if they end up, for example, like taking on c4, eventually you might even be able to play e4, knight e3, and look at these two squares, d5 and f5 here. We would be pretty happy to see that. Um, and that's why I think they played rook h to e8. It is a reasonable developing move too. So that does have that going for it. I took on d5. Rook takes on d5. If they end up taking on e3 instead, now taking on c6 does work. And the difference is we are up a tempo. So if they end up taking on d2 with the bishop, we just take the rook on e8. That's another problem with it. The rook on e8 is actually making this impossible to play. And also if they end up playing rook takes on d2, now we just have king takes e3. Their rook on d2 is attacked, and so is their rook on e8. So if they move away this rook, they'll lose the exchange and just beat down the rook. As you can see here, we just have an extra rook. And again, if they defend it like this, then they'll just be down a bishop, which is, I wouldn't say equally as bad, but both are just completely losing. So I guess you could say it's equally as bad. Rook takes on d5, knight to c4 now. And they ended up playing bishop to d8. And I think they were afraid because you could take on e3, and it might actually be the best choice. Knight takes on e3 is not really a good option. It turns out you can play f takes on e3. Like, I mean, knight takes e3 is fine because it does gain a tempo, but f takes e3 is really, really strong, just like the other variation. Because, for example, king c7, there is knight b6 as a threat because then the rook is on d5 now instead of d8. King c5, e4, and if they go back, then knight to e3. And again, we're looking at d5 and f5 and have a decent amount of activity. So I think they were a bit afraid of this, and that's why they played bishop to d8. We see rook g to d1, and black still will take a couple moves to get their own other rook on the file. And you're kind of forced into trading here. Rook takes d1, rook takes d1. I mean, you can play this move, rook to d7, but I just feel like this is punishing yourself, where I can just take and then go rook to d1 with check. So yeah, rook takes on d1, rook takes on d1, and bishop to c7, just to cover some of these weak dark squares. But white does have a decent position. It's just a matter of what to play. Here I ended up going for knight to d6, which is likely the best move, but there are some interesting other options that we have to keep in mind. The worst one is bishop to b6. So I don't think this is a good idea because after rook to d8, it feels like things just get exchanged and liquidated. And after king takes, bishop takes c7, king takes c7, I'm not really sure if there's enough to play for here. I mean, knight e3 is interesting, but after g6, there's not really much more to play for. Because knight to d5 had some relevance when rooks were on the board, but after knight to d5, you could just bring your king up, and I think you're just totally fine here. Instead, there is the move knight to b6, which is quite interesting. And I didn't want to play this because I didn't like the fact that there was king to b8, just ignoring it. And because I wanted the bishop versus the knight, as we'll see in the game. But if you end up taking it, um, the engine does like this for black, as in it thinks that this is the best route to go. But I feel like this is very inhuman, and we'll see why. So bishop takes, knight to b8. I thought that rook e7 to d7 was decent for black. Computer's not that big of a fan. I think it has something to do with bishop to c5 with f8 coming. And if you go back, then you just kind of wasted your move. And yeah, you can maybe just follow up with b4 to b5 now, and trying to make some headway on the queen side. But yeah, bishop takes b6, knight to b8, c4 is surprisingly good. Knight to d7, bishop to e3, a5, and you're trying to get this dark square blockade on the queen side. Just making sure that there's no break with b4, b5, c5 stuff. b6, white should just go for it with c5. But after takes, bishop takes, and knight to f6, they're ending up getting this pawn. But rook d1, it still goes on. Rook g1, f5, h3, knight f6 takes. And yeah, it's just a crazy variation. It's pretty straightforward because it's just a lot of captures and threats, so it's pretty forcing. And black will be okay after this move, knight h5, with ideas of knight to f4. But it feels like with these two pawns, and this pawn on a5 probably should just drop after something like rook a7 or even bishop to b6. Feels like white is the one having fun here. So that's good to know. But again, this is pretty deep into computer territory at this point. Uh, yeah, and that's why I ended up going knight to d6, because the other two were not clear to me at all. This one, you're forced to take on d6 unless you want to lose the exchange. And of course, that's just awful. So bishop takes d6, rook takes d6. You could go rook to d8, but I like this move, king to c7, where after rook d1, then you play rook to d8. But it turns out rook to d8 is a losing move. And the reason why is because the endgame is incredibly good for white, because there's pawns on both sides of the board. Stockfish really, really, really likes white's position after rook to d8, and instead wants a move like knight to e7, where after b4, trying to make some headway on the queen side, f5, and you get a lot of activity with the black pieces, despite giving yourself an isolated pawn. For example, takes. You give yourself an isolated pawn on e5. It's not really easy to target. So yeah, these are the best chances you have. But rook to d8, of course, we should just exchange. There's not really another move to consider, because if we allow rook takes d1, king takes d1, our king is a little bit worse. Whereas when we capture them, they have to worsen one of their pieces just for one move. So we see knight takes on d8, king to d3, king to d6, and I played king to c4. But it turns out b4 is winning. And the reason why is because after knight e6, you can go h4, and black is nearly in zugzwang. It turns out, uh, honestly, the only move that I can see that doesn't like lose material or lose in a human way is f6, but it still pretty much does lose, because you could play h5 and you have clear headway to the king side, and you still have some targets on the queen side as well. So it's kind of like a principle of two weaknesses here. So really unfortunate. And yeah, your next move is probably going to be king to e4, where it's really hard to think of a good response to it, because if you end up trying to go back, then king to d5 is possible, and you can start trying to go for the queen side, and you're still playing again on both sides of the board. So not ideal in any stretch of the means. Yeah, so that's what I should have done, but I played king c4, which allows king c6. So it's important because in this position, we want to play b4, and that was kind of my idea until I realized that b5 is playable. So b5, the idea is, well, they're trying to pretty much blockade this pawn, and now all of a sudden these pawns really aren't going to be moving anytime soon. And yeah, I mean, we could try taking here, but again, after king d to d5, we have to be worried we're not even like potentially losing, because once e4 check gets played, they get access to the c4 square as well, and we can't play c4 here. If we could, then it would be decent. And same thing with the other side. Probably the best bet is to try king b3, but after king to d5, important to play king d5 because something like this c4 should be played, and white does maintain some sort of advantage. But yeah, after king to d5, white has to be incredibly careful here not to be in trouble because again, not only is c4 prevented, but you can imagine something like king e4 to f3, and also this knight will now get back into the game, and I think black has nothing to complain about. So I ended up playing a5 because of this, going for b4, maybe moving out of the way and going for c4. But I really should just go back to d3, where b5, king e4, attacking the pawn. We're not really scared of this. This is actually a trade we're incredibly happy with because it kind of opens the position more and helps the bishop get more activity. But yeah, king d to d6. Now we trade, and we can go f4. And I think white does have decent chances to win the game and is considerably better here after takes and takes, for example. So instead, a5 was played, f6, and yeah, it's pretty close. It's not quite even. White does still have a little bit of an edge here. I do like this move h4. H4 is quite interesting. The idea is, again, trying to go h5, but it's already a little bit late because we're not really playing for the right plan. Also, king to d3 is quite reasonable as well. But instead, I go for b4, knight to f7, and bishop to c5. So I had some interesting ideas here. One of them was trying to see if they play knight to d6. Um, where I was thinking about taking, like for example, takes, and then b5. It looks like white does have a winning position. So it was kind of a preventative move, but it does allow, of course, knight to g5. So knight g5 was actually played. Turns out, yeah, g6 was just better here because after g6, if we try to target the dark squares, bishop f8, they just go f5, and yeah, there's no more dark squares to cover. The knight is defending e5 and h6. Their king is actually incredibly well placed now, preventing b5 or king d5, and there's not really much to play for. But after knight to g5, white is now winning, and it's all thanks to this one move h4. And it turns out this move is just really bad to allow because now if you go back to f7 and try the same thing, instead of bishop f8, we can actually go h5. And now bishop to f8 comes, and we're scooping up this pawn instead, which is quite massive. And there's not a good response to it. And instead, if you go to f3, which is what happened in the game, we can go, or sorry, it didn't happen in the game. If you go to f3, then we have h5 again, fixing the pawns with potential of bishop to f8. So knight to e4 was played, and again, h5 is just going to be the move over and over again. Knight takes c5 is what I was worried about, though, and that's why I didn't end up playing it. I played bishop to e3. But let's see why exactly this move h5 is so strong. So knight takes c5, pawn takes c5, e4, and king to d4. So the reason why this all works is because we're controlling a specific square. It's the b4 square, and this is what I missed. So king b5, king d5, takes, and then c6, forcing an exchange here. B takes c6, king takes. If king b4 was playable, for example, like if the pawn was on c4, king b4 would be a quite decent move. And when you even just see this position, you actually start realizing that black is actually lost because they have to play king a4, which is a waste of time. It's important not to play king b6. You should play c4 instead, where after king b4, c5, a5, king d5, a4, c6, and both sides just keep advancing. Where after c8 equals queen, they can queen as well, but we have very important move. We don't want to play queen c4 check, allowing king a5. Instead, we want to play queen c5 check, forcing them closer to their queen, which will allow some discoveries here. Or not discovery, but like skewers, but forcing a trade. So for example, king b3, now queen c4, getting them even closer to the queen, And yeah, now they're forced into a trade. For example, king b2, queen d4 check. And if they go king to a3, queen a6, and both will transpose. But the whole point here is that white is just way too fast. And h6 and at least h6 is going to fall. If you go king e5, then you don't win f6. But yeah, king takes h6, king g6, and you just push the h-pawn. And this is completely winning. So going all the way back here, bishop to e3 was played, and this is a blunder. But there's still a few chances in the game to go. Knight to d6, king to d3, and king to d5, very strong move. I end up playing bishop to c5, and what they should really do here is just play e4. And after e4, king e3, knight c4 check, king f4. You could even just go for it with g5, takes. With the f pawn, very important, just so the king takes quite a while to go for h6. Liquidations are going to happen. So knight takes a5 is a pretty strong move. The whole point is b takes a5 is actually a blunder thanks to king takes c5, king g6, and b6 after the trade. Yeah, black's pawn is just incredibly fast, and white is losing. So you can't really play that. And you're forced into playing bishop to f8. But now, knight c4 takes, and e3. You have to take this guy because you can't allow e2. So takes, knight takes e3, king g5, and black is going to be ready to take on g4. A pretty cool variation is king c4, where after bishop to g7, defending c3, you actually just focus on creating a passed a pawn now with b6. So a5 is coming. King h5, trying to get out of the way and create a pawn, or start pushing this pawn ourselves. It's better than something like king h6, where they can just take it, but king h5, black just takes the pawn. And the point is a5, and you're going to have to play bishop to f8 in order to make sure the pawn doesn't just promote here. So bishop takes and king takes c3, and this is just a draw. So, yeah, but you don't have to go way down that line to realize that e4 check is just a much better move because they get access to c4. Instead, knight to c4 was played, where now I get the chance to play f3, prevent e4, which is really nice to prevent, by the way. And now they go g6. So g6 is pretty nice. They might be going for h5 next, or even f5. So what I really want to do here is make sure that I can at least have some sort of target on the king side. And that's why I played the move h5 myself. Just so if I play bishop to f8, this pawn is quite weak. They end up taking and playing the move knight to d6. And this is fine, but there's a pretty interesting trick here that's allowed, and that's c4 with check. So the whole point here is that they take, and after bishop to f8, they need to find only one. There's only one move that actually works here. If they go knight to d6, we can take on h6, go bishop to d2, and after f5, we go h6. And this is kind of a zugzwang again, where after f4, it's just a reasonable move. h7, knight h8, we go bishop to e1. And after knight f7, bishop to h4, king e6, we have access to the c4 square, as you can see. And because of that, we also have access to e4. But if we did not have access, especially to c4, we wouldn't be able to make way on the queen side. And that's a really important thing here. So if you go all the way back and show the move b5, this is not something I actually had seen. But the whole point here is now after bishop takes h6, knight to d6, bishop to d2, knight f7, and we go into h6 and f5. Now, if we say try to play the exact same variation here, sorry, h7. If we try to play the exact same variation here, let's say f4, bishop to e1. Now there will be moves like king to e6 to defend the f6 square. And the reason why it's so important is because if you just do nothing, you just shuffle, then this move, bishop to f6, will come and white will be winning. So you need to play king to e6 at some point. You don't have to go any further than that. You just have to make sure it's on e6. But yeah, king to e4, you're not really going to be getting anywhere. But if you could force them to e6 and then get to c4 and then move up the board, that's a pretty big deal. So yeah, that would have been really nice to be able to play. King to e6 was played instead of knight takes on c4, and I think it's because they were quite worried about this variation, and they didn't realize that after f5, f4, they could bring their king back to e6, specifically if they play this move b5, but very hard move to see again, b5. So king e6, and now we can actually trade because there's a good move here, and uh, it's a pretty good pausing moment. I have about 10 minutes on my clock. I'm pretty sure I just played this instantly. And yeah. So the move here is f4. It's just a key move. You need to see this. The whole reason is because if they get to play f5 here, then there's just no way to make any progress. But after f4, they don't have time for f5 because we can now take on e5, which is a big deal, and they won't be able to create a pass pawn or at least keep that nice pawn in the center. Because, for example, again, after f5, if we play f4, they can play e4, or maybe even they can take. I'm not 100% sure on that, but they could at least play e4, and yeah, genuinely no progress to be made. But f4, there's a few ways to play. They end up playing king e6, but if they take on f4, we just get this variation with king e3, f5, b5, f4, king f3. They could go d4 or to f5, but they actually just transpose. So king to d4 is maybe a slightly more challenging position, but takes, king takes f4, and yeah, white just wins the race by quite a bit. And it's the same in the other variation. So going back, um, all the way to this position, they end up playing king e6, where we end up just trading. And after king takes e5, I played b5 because we are ready to create a pass pawn. For example, if they take here, um, that means that a6 will come and they'll have to be distracted by it. And in the meantime, we are able to win on the side of the board because this is a winning position after king e6 when they allowed the king and pawn ending. So king to d6, king e4, king c5. Make sure we take. If we allow king takes on c4, that's not really too smart. But yeah, this is just a very simple way to play it. Um, king f5. Oh, sorry, yeah. What we'd be allowing here is if we go king f5, they can actually take here. My apologies. This is the move you have to be worried about. But b takes on a6. B takes on a6, king f5, king takes c4. He only has about a minute left at this point. King takes f6, and then king to d5 was played. But he also kind of flagged when he played the move. So like he wasn't able to hit the clock. He played the move, was about to hit the clock, and but it was yeah, again, he lost on time. So yeah, the game is over anyways. I was kind of like delirious because it was a really really long game. It was close to 50 moves. It was 46 moves, and we both were not like low on time. It's a king and pawn ending, so it doesn't matter too much. But I had 9 minutes. He had about one. So yeah, that's pretty low, meaning that the entire 90 minutes for both sides was used up, and the game was at like 7 or 6 or something. So this was till like 11. It was pretty late. But the reason why it's winning is because after king g6, king e6, takes, we can gain opposition here and force our way out. And if this was just an h pawn, it would be a draw. And the reason why is because after h6, they could play king f8. And this position would be a draw if we just play h7 or whatever. But because we have this a pawn as well, we're winning. So king f6, king h7, we bring our king over, take the pawn, king b7, and the game is just over because we're supporting the pawn. And lastly, there is also king to f6, but king to g8, where after king g6, we play h7 and we win directly. And so, yeah, a pretty crazy game. To finish things off, it was a pretty big confidence boost because this was the second National Master I believe I had beaten up to this point, and I believe the third titled player, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong there, but I think that is correct. And as long as I have even a suboptimal tournament at this point, my national rating should actually cross 2,000. This left my career score at 66 wins, 26 draws, and 39 losses. And one of the more notable things about it was the accuracy was quite high. There were a couple decently large mistakes, but it was kind of a long one, and there was still quite a bit of room, even when moves were like slightly dubious or anything like that. Uh, the computer gave my game a 96.5 accuracy, bringing my career average accuracy up to 85.61. And since we're 130 games in, getting that increase of 0.11 doesn't seem like a lot, but it it kind of is. Previously it was at 85.5, now it's at 85.61. And again, National Masters, I believe, play close to an 89% accuracy level over the board on average uh, among their games. So, yeah, we're getting closer and closer to that average for accuracy, uh, playing better, winning good games. Anyways, that's going to cover it for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed and maybe learned something along the way as well. And I'll see you in round two. Bye bye.